Prior to this weekend's Australian Grand Prix, there was one huge F1 scandal percolating under the radar. The FIA was not the first to investigate the subject of flexible rear wings, often known as Mini-DRS. And back before the first Grand Prix, the teams and fans were pretty sure the phenomenon was gone. The concept, which was first seen at McLaren in Baku last year, has sparked much debate among teams. Over the winter, the FIA decided to impose stricter regulations and tests on the appearance of flexi wings. So, things should have been good by now. However, last weekend teams still got caught with an illegal wing. So, following last weekend's events in Melbourne, the FIA promptly implemented even harsher technical regulations. And this will hurt some teams on the grid, but in particular McLaren, Mercedes, and Ferrari. So, could Red Bull be the fastest car once again this weekend in China? And have they finally got what they wanted? A fix to their problems? Why are the FIA proposing harsher regulations? Perhaps more than any other sport, Formula One is marked by grey regions. Teams frequently stretch the limits of the regulations in order to get an advantage over their competitors. In some situations, the FIA approves teams' plans for implementing a more unique interpretation of the regulations. Flexi wings were expected to fall into this category by the end of last year. Over the winter, however, the FIA felt that more stringent restrictions were required, probably due to pressure from some teams on the grid. The pressure got so high that new technical standards were created to avoid front wing bending, a grey area that has received a lot of attention in recent months. These alterations were planned to be implemented for the Spanish Grand Prix, giving teams some breathing room to make adjustments. Crucially, the FIA also implemented measures, such as new cameras, to monitor rear wing movement during round 1. And this is where it went wrong for some teams last weekend, as the federation's discoveries prompted an urgent response, with the goal of preventing teams from bypassing their testing. The FIA has traditionally used static testing to assess wing flexing. However, it is believed that some teams have devised ways to pass these static testing while still benefiting from flexible wings on track. As a result, new measures are being implemented, effective immediately. The amended Articles 3.1517 and 3.1512b, which govern the movement of the rear wing. Beam wing group with a tightening of the static testing went into effect with the Australian Grand Prix. The beam wing checks did not pose any problems for the cars, but the federation took action during the Bahrain tests to put an end to the Mini-DRS issue. So, the additional cameras that framed the rear wings left no doubt in the minds of the men led by Jan Monchot, the federation's technical director from 2024, who informed the teams Monday morning that they wanted to proceed with a further revision of the technical directive, beginning with the Chinese Grand Prix, to counter the excessive deflection of the rear wings observed in Australia. Article 3.1517, which refers to the slot gap test between the main plane and the movable wing, will be modified to require no more than 0.5 mm when a force of 750 newtons is applied to the wingtips with the car stationary, as opposed to the 2 mm allowed up to Australia. Due to the short notice, a 0.25 mm tolerance will be introduced to the revised limit for the Chinese GP alone. The test is performed by applying vertical loads to the left and right sides of an area between the rear wing's mainplane and the adjustable flap. And this massive drop will hurt some teams in the short and long term, as top speed will now go down for those affected. The 75% drop from the previous tolerance threshold results in very minimal mobility in the carbon structure. In Australia, the top team's DRS effect showed a small percentage delta between closed flap and open flap, which corresponded to an average speed increase of 23 km per hour, plus 24 km per hour for Mercedes, plus 23 for McLaren and Red Bull, plus 22 km per hour for Ferrari, representing an 8% increase over maximum speed. The federation is targeting the abuse of deflections rather than a specific team. Despite ongoing steps, the phenomenon continues to expand. It is understood, however, that certain teams may be more negatively affected than others on this front. We're looking at you, McLaren. This is the official statement from the FIA on the matter. As has been previously communicated, between the end of the 2024 season and the start of the 2025 season, The FIA exercised the authority it is granted under Article 3.151 of the Technical Regulations to introduce either new or more challenging load deflection tests for the front wing, from Race 9, Spanish Grand Prix, the upper rear wing, and the beam rear wing. In addition, the FIA requested to the teams to use cameras in free practice sessions to monitor the on-track deformations exhibited by the cars during the Australian Grand Prix. Having analysed footage from the rear wing deformations combined to the static deflections measured inside the FIA garage in Melbourne, the FIA has concluded that sufficient grounds exist for a tougher test to be introduced from the forthcoming Chinese Grand Prix on the upper rear wing. More specifically, Article 3.1517, introduced in 2025, states that if 75 kilograms of vertical load is applied on either extremity of the rear wing mainplane, the distance between the mainplane and the flap, also known as slot gap, must not vary by more than 2 mm. From the forthcoming Grand Prix in Shanghai, this limit will be reduced to 0.5 mm. Due to the short notice for Shanghai, only a tolerance of 0.25 mm will be added to this new limit. The teams were informed of this revised test early Monday, 17th of March. The FIA wishes to further confirm that during the Melbourne event, all cars tested against the requirements of Article 3.15.17 and found to comply. Therefore, all cars raced in Melbourne were deemed to be legal. Will this really turn things around for some teams? What do you think? So, who are the winners and losers in the FIA's recent directive change? At this point, it's unclear how the latest FIA clampdown will affect the pecking order. It is no secret that McLaren was the first to test the limits of aeroelasticity last season. However, this does not necessarily imply that they will be the most impacted by these technological advancements. After all, the Woking-based company indicated during the winter that tighter checks were not a serious worry. Still, prior to Australia, it was expected that stiffer tests would be imposed at the Spanish Grand Prix, round 9, rather than in China. This requires teams to make immediate changes rather than more incremental ones. Regardless, this weekend in Shanghai will shed additional light on how the MCL39 is affected. Other teams on the grid will profit from this move, as long as they were not already pushing the limits of what the regulations allowed. Crucially, Red Bull technical director Pierre Wache was the first to suggest during pre-season testing that other teams were still adopting the Mini-DRS ruse. Wache specifically criticized McLaren and Ferrari. "It is still going on," he said in Bahrain during pre-season testing. "I think Ferrari and McLaren are doing the Mini-DRS stuff still." Given that Red Bull raised the alert during testing, it appears safe to presume the RB21 will be unaffected. However, even this idea is difficult to confirm, at least until this weekend's Chinese Grand Prix begins. Still, it appears that there will be more debates about flexi-wings in the coming weeks. Given that the FIA felt compelled to rapidly apply new procedures following their observations in Australia, this new rule might have a big impact on the field, especially considering the fact that it's going to be cut down by 75%, and that's a lot in F1 terms. So have Red Bull won a battle here? And will the other top teams feel this change? And more important, will the McLaren rocket ship be held back by these changes? Or is their advantage so big, they don't have to worry about it like Zak Brown said at the end of last year? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and don't forget to put your recommendations for China in there as well.